And good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Progressive Magazine's live book event tonight with Victoria Law. And the event is just about to begin, but I wanted to start out by thanking all of you for coming and tell you a little bit about the Progressive Magazine. We are a 113, I think now, year-old magazine, 112. And this is our most recent issue, just out. And it includes a review of Victoria Law's new book, as well as many other exciting articles. Also, want to mention, since the topic tonight is prisons, that the Progressive offers a free subscription to any inmate that asks for one. And that's available by they simply write us a letter and say we'd like to get a free subscription. So thank you very much for your support that enables us to do that. And speaking of support, if you want to get a copy of the book tonight, you can go to our website, progressive.org. And actually, if you go to, I'll put the link up in the screen in a minute. You go to indiepublishers.org/book event, and then you'll be able to make a donation to the Progressive, and you'll be able to get a copy of that book that's going to be discussed tonight. Well, without further ado, I want to welcome our guest, Victoria Law, and also Bill Leaders, the editor of the Progressive Magazine, who is going to be interviewing Victoria tonight. Welcome, Victoria Law and Bill Leaders, and I'm going to exit out of the screen here.
Thank you, Norm. Thank you, folks, for joining. We're here to discuss an important new book that was just released this week, Prisons Make Us Safer and 20 Other Myths About Mass Incarceration, by Victoria Law, a writer who lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. It has been my great pleasure to work with Victoria on a couple of stories that have appeared in the Progressive Magazine in recent months. One was about a pioneering program in New Orleans that teaches criminal defendants and their families how to participate actively in their defense. Two of the subjects from that article, Ron and Fox Rich, are now the subject of an acclaimed documentary, Time, which is nominated for an Academy Award. The other article was about the aging of the nation's prison population, and Victoria is working on a story for our next issue, our June-July issue, which I am looking forward to. This, Prison Make Us Safer, is Victoria's third book, I believe, after Resistance Behind Bars, The Struggles of Incarcerated Women, which came out in 2012, and Prison by Any Other Name, The Harmful Consequences of Popular Reforms, which she co-authored with Maya Shenwar last year. So my first question to you, Victoria, is this: how and why did you come to focus on prisons as a coverage area in your work?
Well, you could say that actually prisons brought me into journalism. So it actually was kind of the opposite way. When I was in high school, I went to what would now be called a school to prison pipeline high school. So for viewers who are not familiar with that term, it is a school that looks a lot like a prison, or looks like it is preparing its students for prison rather than college or careers. It was mostly Black, brown, and immigrant. Every morning we had to walk through metal detectors and put our belongings through an airport scanning bag. There were several thousand students. This was a high school, grades 9, 10, 11, 12, 4 grades, several thousand students. There were school security officers that acted like overbearing police officers or prison guards at times. There were overcrowded classrooms. So if you did not, say, excel in the classroom or cause trouble, you were kind of like lost in the shuffle because there were so many students. And it was a perfect recruiting ground for gangs. So many of my friends joined gangs, dropped out of school, ended up getting arrested for gang-related activity, and went to jail, which in New York City is Rikers Island, an entire island devoted to jails. And that was my introduction to incarceration was I was 15 years old, and suddenly my friends were all disappearing off into jails and then later on to prisons after they pled guilty in court and were sent to prisons upstate. Fast forward to college, I started looking for a political science class. I started looking at resistance and organizing inside prisons after the 1970s. What happens as mass incarceration starts to grow under Reagan? What happens when there are no longer groups like the Black Panthers or the Young Lords or the Gray Panthers that are working with people inside prisons? What does resistance and organizing look like? And what I learned was that most of what we considered resistance and organizing that was reported was about men. And I thought, well, it can't be that there are 99,000 women in prisons and jails and they're all quietly sitting on their hands. So I started looking at what women in prison were doing, and I found that they had not only the same issues as their male counterparts, but other issues such as trying to maintain custody and contact with their children, particularly their minor children whom they'd left behind when they were arrested and incarcerated, reproductive health care, being pregnant inside prison, trying to resist or endure or heal from sexual violence that happened either before their arrest and then sexual violence that happened while they were incarcerated. And at the same time, I was seeing that they were actually organizing to resist these conditions and sometimes change these conditions and the policies that led them to there. And I wasn't seeing this reported anywhere at all. And that's what led me into journalism, was knowing that there were these stories and there were so many of them. And again, I wasn't seeing any of them being reported in any of the media that I was reading. If prison issues were being reported, and in the early 2000s, they very rarely were, it was focused on men, not necessarily focused on women. And the rare story about a woman in prison would paint her as a victim. You know, a woman was pregnant, she was shackled while she was in labor. Being shackled, if you imagine the old movies about slavery, means that you have handcuffs there on your hands, a chain that leads to your belly, a giant belly chain that if you ride a bicycle is about as heavy as a bicycle chain, and another chain that leads to your feet, which are cuffed together. But it wouldn't talk about the women who are organizing for laws to ban this practice. It wouldn't talk about what women were doing for each other. And that was why I became a journalist, was to be able to illuminate these stories.
Eleanor Bader interviewed you. It's up on our website recently about your new book and other issues. She referred to you as a lifelong advocate of prison abolition. Explain to us what that means.
So prison abolition is both the idea that prisons can be abolished, but that also that the societal causes that lead people into prison can also need to be addressed and uprooted and abolished. So it's not that prisons themselves, like are going to just go away magically, but we need to also address the root causes of what leads to mass incarceration. We need to address chronic poverty. We need to address racism. We need to address the lack of educational and economic opportunities. We need to address the fact that we don't have safe and affordable housing for people. We don't have a robust mental health care system in this country. We don't have universal health care. We don't have all of these things that meet people's basic needs. And when you don't have those things, you can't begin to address what causes violence and harm. But when you start having these things, then you start chipping away at some of the root causes of what causes violence, what causes harm, and also what causes crime. So if you have a society in which nobody goes hungry and everybody has guaranteed housing in some way, shape, or form, then you're going to have a lot fewer people actually participating in criminalized activities. If you have access to mental health care for everybody, you're going to have a lot fewer instances, if any, in which people do something because they have just hit a breaking point in their downward spiral with their mental health struggles.
Yeah, as you know, and as Norm mentioned, I reviewed your book in the most recent issue, The Progressive, and I thought long and hard about what to headline the review. I ended up calling it The Truth About Prisons. Because I note that your book, Prisons Make Us Safer and Other Myths, takes the approach that it takes on the various myths that exist around incarceration,
Mm-hmm.
mass incarceration, and it explodes them. And I think it's valuable in that you demonstrate through this book that much of what we believe about prisons is wrong. Why did you decide to structure your book in this way as a response to myths rather than just, to come out and say what you think things are?
Well, a large part of that was seeing that there was more of an interest in prison issues and mass incarceration now than there was even 10 years ago. So I was seeing more and more people becoming interested in prison issues or becoming curious about prison issues and acknowledging that there were too many people in prison, that the prison system was bloated, and there didn't need to be this gigantic system that incarcerated 2.3 million people. But at the same time, because they were new and because there wasn't necessarily, and they weren't tuned into some of the political conversations about prisons, it was very easy to misidentify root causes of prisons or believe things about prison conditions that were not right, such as prisons provide medical care, or everybody in prison gets good medical care, or they are purveyors of mental health care. So I wanted to be able to have a book that busted these myths so that you could hand it to somebody who is just starting to think about prisons, who perhaps saw Ava DuVernay's The 13th, or saw the biopic of Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy, or, read The New Jim Crow, but then was like, but, what is this about prisons that, what's driving mass incarceration? What are the conditions inside? And when we talk about mass incarceration, who are we talking about? And also, who are the people that we're not talking about so much? I had to devote a whole section to the invisible populations within the walls, such as women, women in prison, such as trans people in prison, and immigrants in immigrant detention, who are often seen as a separate category as people in state and federal prisons, even though they have many, many, many of the same restrictions and abuses and injustices as their imprisoned counterparts.
So one of the central ones is that you go right after this notion that prisons make us safer, and also you go after the notion that people need to be punished in order to be rehabilitated before they can accept responsibility for their actions and be rehabilitated. Why do those theories not hold water? What is wrong with that picture?
Well, first of all, we have to remember that we're all taught from a very early age that prisons are where the bad guys go. Police keep us safer. If we didn't have prisons, there would be, a tremendous amount of violence and chaos. But we have to remember that the United States has 5% of the world's population and between 20 to 25% of the world's prison population. So that, if prisons kept us safer, should mean that the United States is the safest nation in the world. And we clearly are not. As we see, anytime you open the newspaper or any type of news feed, you can clearly see that we are not we are far from the safest nation in the world. We also have to remember that a lot of times people don't report crimes that happen to them. According to the U.S. Department of Justice's own statistics, something like 52% of violent crimes go unreported each year. So that means that over half of people who experience violent crimes have chosen not to report them to the police. And of those that are reported, fewer than half of them result in arrest, fewer than half of those result in incarceration. And at the same time, we have to think about the fact that policing and prosecution and prisons come after the fact, which we don't want them to come before the fact and preemptively start arresting people for no good reason, but they happen after harm has occurred. It doesn't happen none of this happens before. It's not a preventative. So viewers who think back on their past week and think about all the things that irritated them, whether it was like a noisy neighbor, doing things late at night. If you live in an apartment building and you're like, why are you making that noise? To somebody who cuts you off in line at the grocery store or cuts you off in traffic, or, I don't know, doesn't pick up after their dog on your lawn or whatever. They should ask themselves, how often did I respond during this past week by, taking out a baseball bat and beating that person bloody? Or how often did I respond by like, punching them in the face? And then did I not do those things because I'm afraid of the police and prisons? Or did I not do those things because even if I'm upset, I don't act on these types of impulses? So prisons do not deter people from acting or not acting on violent impulses. I mean, I'm assuming that when you have a bad day, you do not go take it out. You do not refrain from violently taking it out on somebody because you are afraid of police and prisons. You might briefly think about doing something and then say, yeah, okay, great. I had my little revenge fantasy. Maybe I'll say something snarky, but that's about it.
But people do commit acts of violence. People do terrible things to each other. And you can make the case, and you do it very well, that prisons don't deter that behavior. Mm-hmm. What does?
What deters that behavior, I think, is more work in the long term than what prisons offer. So as I just pointed out, people are do not refrain from acting violently or causing harm because they're afraid of prisons. And people who do cause harm are not thinking about policing in prisons in that moment. Even Dylan Roof, who went and shot people in a Black church, when he thought about policing, he thought, I should keep a bullet in my gun to kill myself so I don't get arrested. He did not think, I shouldn't do this because I might get arrested. So what does deter people is we have to look at what I said earlier about abolitionists looking at root causes. Why are people committing harm and violence? And some of this might be because of exacerbated mental health issues. It might be because of poverty. There's a criminal justice lawyer or a criminal lawyer who works with women in prison named Lee Goodmark, who has made the correlation that when people are experiencing economic stresses, that leads to increased domestic violence. So when she looked at what domestic violence calls and rates were like during the pandemic, and rates dropped when economic stimulus checks came in because there was a lot less stress, there was a lot less anxiety than when people were just stressed out about being unemployed and being stuck at home all of the time. This is not to excuse people who act abusively towards their spouses, but one of the things we can look at is poverty and economics. One of the things we can look at is intergenerational trauma and violence. If people grow up unintentionally or subconsciously mimicking, like the behaviors that they've been taught. So what do you need to do to unteach people these types of behaviors? I mean, because we know that they can eventually be untaught, but what needs to go into that? And prisons don't do anything to make people reckon with the harms and the violence that they've caused.
Some of these myths are kind of predicated on nasty assumptions, like the myth that inmates have it really good when it comes to healthcare. They get free healthcare. Mm-hmm. You even go to jail because they want this problem taken care of. And as you know, and as I've reported in my career, I mean, mm-hmm. healthcare in jails and prison is just like a step above leeches and exorcisms. Mm-hmm. It's terrible. And yet these myths come into play and people believe them. You think part of it is there's this desire to generate resentment toward people who are in prison as a way of justifying the way that they're treated?
I'd never thought about it as generating this desire, but I mean, we can definitely see this in some of the media coverage. Whenever somebody says, oh, people in prison have access to medical care. And I mean, I think it is a way to perhaps deflect or against the fact that so many people out here in the United States don't have access to medical care. So perhaps it's generating resentment, but it's also, if we are so focused on being outraged that Jimmy, who robbed 3 banks, can get a lung transplant, or, Betty Sue, who, was dealing drugs, might be able to get, I don't know, diabetes treatment, but their unincarcerated counterparts, have to stand in long lines at clinics, might be shuffled around and might never get the care that they need. It's very easy for people to focus their resentment on Jimmy and Betty Sue in prison getting medical care, and not all of these other people on the outside who aren't able to get medical care because this country does not have any sort of universal or robust healthcare system to take care of all of its residents.
Another one of the myths that you go after is this idea that prisons are, and idea that I think is held by a lot of people of progressive bent, that the prisons are full of nonviolent drug offenders. And I was surprised when I saw the statistics for the state of Wisconsin in terms of the number of people who are in our prison system for drug offenses is really quite small. It's much more in the federal system. But you make that point that myth is dangerous because there are only like 20% of the prison population is there for a nonviolent drug offense. And you have people who are there who are just as deserving of mercy, or just as deserving of rehabilitative treatment that works, but they're not in that category of the nonviolent drug offender. Talk a little bit about that.
So I think that one of that myth that prisons are mostly populated by nonviolent drug offenders, and if we change the laws around nonviolent drug crimes, such as decriminalization of drugs, decriminalization of, small sales, not going after people who play petty roles in drug transactions, such as people who were couriering messages or, taking messages for their partners, who were, drug dealers, we would get rid of mass incarceration. And what that myth does is it allows us to stop at a certain point and leave all of those other people who make up the bulk of people who are in prisons still sitting in prisons. So it doesn't address, again, root causes of why people cause violence or why people are compelled into violence. I mean, one of the other chapters I talk about is the myth of the abuse excuse, in which I look at the role of abuse, and specifically domestic violence, in women's pathways to prison. Because a lot of times women who are incarcerated for violence had previously been in some sort of abusive relationship. And there are studies that show that there have been women who have been pushed into criminalized activity by abusive partners. They would not necessarily have done these activities had they not been afraid of and coerced by these partners. So I think the myth that if we let nonviolent drug offenders out, we have somehow solved the problem of mass incarceration and all can just go home and watch TV and, eat popcorn and not have to think about this anymore, is really dangerous, because what ends up happening is we still have a gigantically bloated prison population. We still have people who are charged and sometimes overcharged with violent offenses, because the way that our laws work is that oftentimes if you were present when someone commits a murder, but you were, say, robbing a store, 3 people rob a store, 1 person shoots the store owner, the other 2 are charged with felony murder, which means you were there and you were in the process of committing another crime. So everybody gets charged the same as if they had pulled the trigger. You have instances in which, something happens and people with the least amount of information get charged with the highest charge because they don't have information to trade to reduce their charge, say from, manslaughter to assault or something else.
One of the people you wrote about in the Progressive article and also in the book is Mary Fish, who you note is someone who has committed violent offenses. I mean, it's related to her drug and alcohol abuse, but it is violence. If you create this situation where you're a nonviolent offender, you really shouldn't be here. Meaning you're a violent offender, you really should. And that's one of the myths that you want to go after, to attack that notion that people who commit violent acts need to be locked up for a good long time. That's the only way that you can deal with them.
Yes. And I also want to point out, and I forget if I wrote it in this book or in an article about her, but Mary Fish's first offense was in 1979. And it's a weird, convoluted story where she was driving her brother, who had just gotten out of prison, to a local bar to cash his prison-issued check. This is 1979. She has her 2-year-old son. They're outside in the car. The brother goes into the bar. The bartender doesn't want to cash the check. And he's taking a good long time. Her son is getting restless. He's honking the car horn. She wants to get out of there, go home, make the kid dinner, put him to bed. So she picks up the baby. She walks into the bar. Her brother is arguing with the bartender, who doesn't want to cash his check. Some guy tries to grope her while she's in the bar. The bartender sees her and the kid, tells her to get the kid out of there. She gets mad and she gets in her car and she drives off. She's just like, screw this, you know? And then she gets a couple of blocks away and she's just like, oh, your brother just got out of prison. You know, what are you doing just abandoning him? You know, how's he going to get home? We live in Oklahoma. You know, it's not like he can like catch a bus or something. So she turns around, and as she's pulling up to the bar, she sees her brother surrounded by police, because apparently the bartender had called the police when he, I guess, refused to leave. And her brother gestures at her, keep driving, just go away, you know, don't get involved. So she makes a U-turn, and one of the police officers thinks she's trying to hit him. Some, you know, high-speed car chase ensues as she tries to get away. She runs out of gas, you know, and ends up getting arrested. And for that, she spends a couple of years in jail, because she's charged with, you know, trying to assault a police officer, even though she's just like, I was trying to make a U-turn because my brother told me to get the heck out of there. So I made it. But while she was in jail, she had, you know, she'd struggled on and off with alcoholism, and somebody gave her a drug. I forget what it was, but somebody was like, hey, you want this? And at that moment, she said she made this decision that she thought would be better and was not. She said, if I take this, whatever it is, this pill, maybe I can lick the alcoholism that has been plaguing me my whole life and has done me no good, and that has done my tribe and my nation, she's a Creek Indian, has done, you know, my tribe and my nation no good historically. So maybe if I take this pill, you know, I can make this alcoholism go away. And what ended up happening was she then became addicted to illicit substances. So she was no longer drinking, but she was now doing all sorts of other drugs. And this happened while she was in jail and while she was in prison. So we can also see prisons as places that are rife environments for people to slide even further down than where they were. So instead of just being a low-income single mother that, you know, perhaps had some questionable driving skills, you know, she then turned into, you know, somebody who was substance using and doing things to support her substance use habit and making even more questionable decisions when she was high.
And when she goes to prison, she becomes a convicted felon, presumably.
Mm-hmm.
She's you know, in the system, and things snowball from there. I did some reporting on this guy who originally went to prison because he struck an EMT while he was having a psychotic episode. And he was convicted of a crime for that. He goes to prison, and his bad behavior in prison kept him there. He couldn't abide by the rules. He couldn't keep out of trouble. And he's still in prison right now for, you know, offenses that he committed as a prisoner. It just snowballs and careens out of control.
Yeah.
Victoria, you were interested in reading a bit from the book to give people a sense of that. Maybe we should take time and do that now.
Sure. Okay. I'm going to read from the chapter that is called that debunks a myth that prisons are places of rehabilitation. The first time Walimo Shakur was sent to juvenile detention, he was 12 years old and had been found guilty of robbery. 6 months later, he was released to his grandmother's house in Los Angeles. Nothing had changed in those 6 months, he recalled. His 4 cousins were still gang members running the streets. When we were at my grandmother's, we talked about what we were doing, learning how to sell drugs, burglaries, and shooting dice and guns. 4 years later, he and his cousin were caught burglarizing a department store. Shakur was sent back to juvenile detention, this time for a year. He spent that year exercising, writing letters to his family and girlfriends, and talking with the friends he made there. Looking back, Shakur, now 46, reflected, "I always thought that breaking the law was how you made it in the ghetto. I was too young to get a job. And besides, if you didn't have any family who owned a small business, you weren't going to find work. Crime is what I was being taught by my older homies. It was how we survived." 5 years after that second incarceration, Shakur was imprisoned again, this time as an adult in California's prison system. At one prison, a riot broke out. "Since this was my first prison sentence, I had to get involved as the older cats expect youngsters to put in work," he explained. Being put to work meant stabbing members of other gangs. And for the next 9 months, Shakur ended up in administrative segregation, the prison's term for solitary confinement, in which a person spends 23 hours a day locked in a cell. But those months in isolation did nothing to rehabilitate him. When he was released from solitary, he attacked another man and was sent back, this time for 16 months. That was when some of the older Black men encouraged him to read Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey, the Black Panthers, and George Jackson. He did, and began to change his thinking. Shakur is quick to note that it wasn't the prison that encouraged this change. Had he not encountered these mentors, he might have continued on the same destructive path. Shakur's experience raises the questions, what does it mean to rehabilitate a person to their former state, if that state involves poverty, racism, unemployment, unstable housing, and/or violence? Can a person be rehabilitated if they have never been habilitated or made fit or capable for society? Many people believe that prisons are sites of rehabilitation. In reality, however, rehabilitative opportunities in prisons are few and far between. Numerous studies have shown that the best form of rehabilitation in prison is education. Approximately 60% of people entering prisons lack high school diplomas or GEDs. While in prison, they may be able to enroll in GED classes, but that's typically where their formal education stops. It wasn't always this way. In 1994, the US had 350 college and prison programs, largely funded by Pell Grants, or non-competitive, need-based federal funding. Pell Grants for people in prison accounted for 0.1%, or 0.1% of the federal grants annual budget. In other words, these grants did not take financial aid away from non-incarcerated college students. In addition, rates of recidivism dropped more than 40% among those who had enrolled in educational programs while incarcerated. But accompanying the rise of tough-on-crime policies and mass incarceration in the 1980s and 1990s came demands to make prisons more severe. Conservative politicians like North Carolina's Senator Jesse Helms stoked outrage that people in prison might be able to enroll in college courses, while the cost of higher education remained out of reach for many law-abiding citizens. The question could have been why college tuition was so expensive in the first place, but his focus was on why people who had been convicted of crimes might benefit during that time behind bars. The 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act cut Pell Grants for people in prison. The move defunded all but 8 of the country's college and prison programs. 2 decades later, in 2015, the Obama administration announced a pilot program to fund 67 colleges to offer courses to approximately 12,000 people in prisons. That year, over 1.5 million people were in state and federal prisons across the country. In other words, less than 1% of the nation's prison population have been able to participate in this modest program. Now, even basic education can be hard to obtain within prisons. In 2020, the Bureau of Prisons announced that 16,400 people were on the waiting list for the federal prisons literacy programs. Prisons generally offer self-help programs, but many students who have participated report that they're often useless. In Texas, Kamadia enrolled in classes that ostensibly addressed toxic relationships, anger management, and bridges to life. She didn't think those classes would rehabilitate her, but was hoping they would increase her chances of parole. "I got nothing out of the classes," she recalled with frustration. Unbelievably, the class that focused on parenting consisted mostly of coloring. The anger management class encouraged women to rip pages out of a book and count to 10 when they felt angry, but it never encouraged students to explore the underlying violence and trauma behind their anger. Even if the classes did encourage participants to talk about their own experiences, The program's group setting prevented them from sharing, let alone exploring their past traumas. You can't expose yourself within a group, Kamadia explained. You can't look weak. If a woman talked about past violence or trauma, other participants would verbally gang up on her. Kamadia recalled that during a domestic violence class, one of her friends talked about being molested as a child and its continued impact on her decision-making as an adult. The truth is, I can more than relate, Kamadia wrote, but knowing how a person's past hardships, perceived as weaknesses by those incarcerated, would be used against her in nearly every future prison interaction, she refrained from commiserating. Instead, she recalled, I did what everyone in the group did. We attacked, verbally. Rather than helping the woman process her trauma, they belittled her for her past experience and for failing to be a strong Black woman, each woman trying to be more vicious than the next. Society thinks people enter a prison and leave better, reflected Kamadia, but it's the opposite. I was an extrovert, ambitious, outdoor-loving person. Now I'm not comfortable with crowds. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, assessing my situation. Instead of rehabilitating her, imprisonment has turned the former Catholic schoolgirl raised on ideals of helping and trusting others into someone who instinctively distrusts any gestures of kindness. I refuse a Kleenex if I have a runny nose, she explained. Reflexively, I think, what does this person want from me? Why would they give me this? Why are they being nice? Her childhood teachings of helping others in need have been replaced by the prison's lesson of remaining silent in the face of injustice and violence. That's the same for Mary Fish, who credits prison for teaching her how to hustle. When she entered prison, her family was unable to send her money that would allow her to buy any of the necessities, such as soap, feminine hygiene products, or snacks that would help her through her 10-year sentence. This is a sentence that she had after that first sentence for allegedly trying to hit a cop with her car. She spent the first 5 years working in the prison kitchen, where she learned to stuff food down her bra or pants and later use it to barter with women whose families did send them money. Another woman introduced her to a more lucrative hustle, writing to lonely men outside of the prison. I had always loved to write, so it became easy to get money orders in from the men I wrote, Fish recalled. I learned to lie really well in those letters. I wrote several men, and I told each one I loved them. I began to have new televisions, new comforters, new clothes ordered from Spiegel, canteen every week, and money on my books. It's important to think about the idea of rehabilitation. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines rehabilitation as the act of restoring something, or in this case, someone, to their former capacity. But what does that mean for the majority of people who end up behind bars? Mary Fish's former capacity was as a Native American woman, an underemployed single mother in Oklahoma, a state with scant resources to help people lift themselves out of poverty. Her life was shaped not only by poverty, but also by family and domestic violence, racism, sexism, and a lack of educational opportunities, despite her consistently acing tests at school. Similarly, Mwalimu Shakur's trajectory was shaped by living in a community in which gangs and crime were the dominant economic opportunity. Prisons cannot address these systemic failures. They can only cover them up.
Throughout the book, in all sorts of ways, that prisons are not a means to achieving a safer society, but it actually is more than that. It's that the way that people are treated in prisons and the culture of incarceration makes us less safe because of the degradation and the dehumanization that is part of it. Would you say?
Yeah. Yes, it does.
One of the things you look at that's more positive and promising is the idea of restorative justice, as opposed to just punishing people. You create an avenue for them to come into contact with their victims, or for their victims to come in contact with them, and achieve some sort of process, create some sort of process that is restorative and regenerative, and leads to something better. Talk more about that and the promise and potential of restorative justice.
Yes. So restorative justice is not actually a new concept. It actually comes from Native American communities, which have practiced this for generations before white settler colonialists landed on the United States, what would become the United States shores, and imposed their criminal justice system here. So restorative justice looks not at Billy hit John, Billy should go to jail and be incapacitated, and maybe John gets an ice pack, for his eye. But it looks at what are the needs that what are the needs of the survivor, and then what can the person who did the harm do to take responsibility and make amends. So in a restorative justice process, what typically ends up happening is that the two parties are first, both parties have to agree to this process. So it is not like I don't want to be part of a restorative justice process as the victim and you are forced to do it. So they have to agree that they want this. And in New York, there's a group called Common Justice that does this process with 18 to 24-year-olds who are accused of violent crimes. So their victims have to agree. And nearly 90% do, not because they're necessarily bleeding heart liberals or they don't want this person to, take responsibility, but because they want this person to never enact that harm again on someone else. And they don't want other people in their communities to be harmed, if this person does not get any sort of help and support to help them change their behaviors. So the restorative justice process often involves, at some point, bringing the two parties together. In some cases, it's both parties work separately with different groups. So a group will work with the person who caused the harm to be like, do you understand what you did? Do you, when you punch that person, do you understand that there were like further ramifications than just what happened in those 5 seconds? But what were the ramifications afterwards? Maybe they had to go to the hospital. Maybe their eyes swelled shut. Maybe they couldn't go to work for 3 days. Maybe, all of these other things. Maybe they incurred a lot of medical bills. Maybe now when they leave the house, they're always looking over their shoulder because they're really afraid that something similar might happen. So it's a process. And then another group works with the person who was victimized or survived the harm to be like, what are your needs? Maybe that person needs somebody to help them because they cannot see, very clearly. Maybe that person needs help, navigating how to get their medical bills covered because they've had to go to numerous doctor visits. Maybe that person has been traumatized and, is afraid of walking the streets alone or at night or whatever, and, might need to, go to therapy or go to counseling to address that so it doesn't become an ingrained, form of trauma. And then at the end, the two parties are frequently brought together in what's called a circle. And it's not just, person who did the harm and person who did the harm, or a person who harmed and person who was harmed, but also their loved ones and family members and community. So people can hear what the ripple effects were of what happened. So the person who, did the harm might hear from, say, the person's mother, who's like, I really worry every time, my kid doesn't call me now, or every time he goes out to work, or every time this happens. As a mother, my heart lurches now because I'm like, is somebody else going to attack him? Maybe his partner, says, we used to be able to go out at night and go, say it's pre-pandemic, and go to the movies and go to dinner, and now we can't because, he has anxiety every time we leave the house. So now, this has impacted our relationship this way. Maybe somebody else says, my best friend, we used to go do this, and now he's different. He's withdrawn, he's sullen, maybe he blows up more, maybe he gets scared more. Whatever all of the ramifications are of being attacked. And the person who caused the harm can see that it wasn't just, so I punched you, you get an ice pack, you're done. But wow, that moment really caused ripple effects, and then can look at how can I make amends to this? And it's not a one size fits all solution the way that prisons are offered, right? Prison offers your one solution. We can lock the person away. We can lock the person away for a varying amount of time, but we can lock the person away. It's not, we can also help you get therapy. We can also help him get anger management. We can help him do this, that, or the other. One example that comes to mind is that recently there was an attack on an Asian person in Portland, Oregon, and that person opted for restorative justice rather than seeking criminal charges against the person who had attacked him, because he didn't want other people to be attacked. So the restorative justice process is going to be facilitated by the local Chinese American something commission, so it would be a process rooted in, why did you do this racist or race-based attack? But it also includes things like anger management, mental health treatment, drug and alcohol abuse treatment, all of the things that might have led to this conglomeration of spiraling towards violence, so that other people would be less likely to be harmed by this person in the future, because there had been steps taken to address some of these underlying issues. And then at the same time, this person would also see it's not that you just punched some random person on the street and got to go home and forget about it, but you could see all of the ripple effects that has as well in this person's life, and take steps to make amends, to try to make things better.
I think you've kind of demonstrated in your book and in your remarks that the destructive thing about prisons comes from our inability to be humane, our desire for revenge and punishment.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in this last week, I watched some of the trial of Derek Chauvin, and to be quite completely honest with you, I hope they lock that guy up for a good long time. I don't care if he has a good time in prison. I feel, he deserves to be punished for the sake of punishment, and maybe that will be an example to the next cop who might want to kill someone for chuckles, that he's had to pay a price, he's had to suffer. And there I am thinking in the terms that your book has helped me to want to reject.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's one thing to have feelings, right? Like, as I gave in the earlier example, we might have feelings of anger, sometimes very irrational anger, at, people every day, but we don't act on them. Just like Derek Chauvin could have just played in his mind that he did some bad thing and not have acted on it. But obviously, he did not restrain himself. But I think that relying on prisons as a deterrent, so we don't build policy based on our feelings. So we can acknowledge those feelings and be like, yes, I hope that when you go to prison, they forget to feed you and you get the worst cell and it's full of roaches and, everybody hates you and they spit in your food when they bother to. You can think all these things, right? But we don't make policy, hopefully, based on those feelings. We don't be like, and now we're going to create a special prison just for you, and it's going to be, if you've ever read the 1950s book, The Rescuers, about mice that break a poet out of a Norwegian prison. It's basically the guy's just in a hole in the ground. He never sees light, food is dropped into him. We're going to just build that for you. So hopefully we don't build policy based on that, or else perhaps we would throw Derek Chauvin in such a hole. But going back to this idea of, prison was not a deterrent for him. He was not thinking about prisons when he killed George Floyd. Derek Chauvin, in his 19 years as a cop, had 18 complaints filed against him. And we know that people often don't file complaints against police officers. It's not that he only did 18 things wrong, but he had 18 complaints filed against him, and he was involved in 3 shootings of other people, one of which was fatal. And the threat of prison did not stop him from engaging in anything that caused people to actually go to the precinct and complain about him, or did not stop him from shooting people while he was a police officer. And it certainly didn't stop him from killing George Floyd in front of a crowd of people, including his coworkers. So I think that we can remove, we could say we feel these things, and then we could say, but we also know that, the threat of prison does not deter people in the moment from committing violence. What would have stopped Derek Chauvin from killing George Floyd? Stripping him of his, authority to be able to kill people when he first started getting complaints, or even after a shooting or a fatal shooting. So George Floyd was not the first person he killed as a Minneapolis police officer. So, looking at it that way, so what would have stopped him is not the threat of prison. What would have stopped him was stopping him sooner. So we could see that prisons is all the threat of imprisonment will also sadly probably not stop the next gung-ho, racist, overzealous, whatever you want to call it, police officer from doing something terrible to the next person that they, that they take their angers, frustrations, whatever out on. Because we see time and time again that police officers kill people. Often they kill people, not necessarily like who are even supposedly any type of threat against them. I mean, George Floyd was handcuffed. He was on the ground. He was not posing a threat to anybody when he was killed. So, just like, Breonna Taylor was in her house. She was not, she should have been safe in her house. So again and again, we see that the threat of prison doesn't stop police from killing people, just as the threat of prison also doesn't stop other people from killing people. Again, because we have such a gigantic prison population, you would think then that this would be a giant cloud over our nation in terms of people being like, oh, no, I don't want to go to prison because, I know that we have a giant prison system, but people aren't thinking of those kinds of repercussions.
It sounds like a strange question, but can prisons be made into better places? I mean, I've visited prisons, federal prisons and state prisons and county jails, and I was given a tour of the Supermax facility that was built in Wisconsin in the 1990s, and the warden showed me how the lights are required to stay on all night long in the inmate cell, and it's against the rules for the inmate to pull the bed sheet up over his head, and if he does, they'll get the guards in to wake him up. Just that kind of purposeful cruelty that is part of the experience. But I also saw when I visited a women's prison, like this pitiful little area that they created for the women in the prison to have visits with their children. And it was just as heartbreaking and horrible as anything. And it was an attempt on the prison's part to do something good. And it was still ugly and awful and nasty and distressing. Is there a way to make a prison better, or are they inherently bad and irredeemable?
Well, I think the thing is, asking about making prisons better then leads to the question of, do we want to keep this as our primary method of supposed safety that continues to fail us over and over and over? So there are ways to make prisons better. I mean, I read a chapter about Norway where it's like, why can't our prisons be more like Norway, in which, they have this, wonderful, humane prison that costs a lot of money to build, like millions of dollars to build, where people are treated humanely, even, what is that guy's name? The man that shot up the summer camp, Anders Breivik or something like that. He is Norwegian. He shot up a summer camp. He was very unrepentant about this. But even he has a nice cell, he is allowed, what is his name? Yeah, Anders Breivik, a far-right Norwegian citizen who set off a car bomb outside the office of the prime minister and then opened fire and killed 77 people, many of them teenagers attending a leftist summer camp. And he was held in an isolation cell, which is basically the equivalent of like a 3-room suite, where he still has access to like college education, television, media. So yes, we can build prisons that are like that, but it would be a tremendous cost. And we can ask ourselves, why would we do that when we can provide services outside in society and whittle away at the prison system so much that it doesn't resemble a prison system anymore? And then for people who need to be away from other people because maybe they seriously need some deprogramming, unlearning, relearning, whatever you want to call it, in order to be safely around people, we can come up with ways to do that don't rely on you get put in this cell, your lights always have to be on. Maybe there's like a nice visiting area, for kids, but then you go back to your cell and the lights are always on and you never actually get to like close your eyes and see darkness. So I think that we can ask ourselves, instead of like, can we make prisons nicer? How do we chip away at these, systems so that way we don't have to say, like, children have to come and visit their mothers inside the prisons. Why can't we be looking at programs that mothers can be doing on the outside, where either they can be with their children or their children can come and see them, not in a sort of carceral setting. In Massachusetts, the Massachusetts passed the heck was it called now? Sorry, I'm forgetting this. But Massachusetts passed a Primary Caregiver Act, where if a parent is convicted at sentencing, they can ask the judge to consider their parental status, and the judge, when deciding the sentence. And they can say, like, Judge, I am the primary caregiver of 2 young children. Please don't sentence me to prison, or please at least don't sentence me to a long time in prison, etc. And the judge has to take that into consideration. And if they choose to send that parent to prison, they have to make a written statement as to why, looking at the alternatives available, they decided on prison rather than, some other type of alternative to prison that is available. So, so it's not just that they've considered it and they just said no. They actually have to justify why. If they are in the Boston area, they couldn't say, okay, but you've got to go to, like drug treatment and job treatment and these things, but you can still go home, to your children, or you can live at this residential, house for people serving alternatives to incarceration, but you can be there with your kids, or your kids can come and spend the weekends with you, but you're not in prison.
What possibilities do you see now for prison reform or criminal justice reform, now that we have a president who's not insane? What can and should the Biden administration be doing to move the needle on these issues?
Well, I think we have to remember that what the Biden administration can do, it can do 2 things. One, it can, start the process of eliminating many of the laws that Biden created or co-created or helped create in the 1980s and 1990s when he was in office. Biden was the author or the co-author of the 1994 crime bill, which I mentioned earlier, which, among other things, cut Pell Grants to people in prison. It also lengthened prison sentences, imposed draconian punishments such as 3 strikes and you're outlaws for a number of federal offenses. It put more money into policing in prisons. So you can start by cutting back all of those, being like, okay, this failed, mea culpa. We talk about restorative justice, like the administration can do this kind of restorative justice work by saying, I did this. I thought it was good. It wasn't like I was punching people in the nose, but obviously it had a tremendous, terrible impact on people. Let's start getting rid of these terrible policies that I co-authored in the 80s and 90s. Let's get rid of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which allows federal prosecutors to go after minor players or people who just have a tangential relationship to somebody accused of federal drug crimes, such as their girlfriends, their mothers, their fathers, their cousins, their babysitter, their, next door neighbor, their little league player. And let's get rid of that. And then let's try to figure out who's in prison based on those outdated, obsolete, and wrong laws that we passed, and free them, not just free them and dump them on the streets, but, free them and give them some sort of support so they can try to rebuild their lives after we've ripped so much away from them. And then he can also set the tone, which is what all of these federal, tough on crime rhetoric and chest beating did, for states to follow, to be like, hey, remember when we used to try to incentivize you to lock more people up? Let's try to incentivize you now to address safety and violence, drug use, and other crimes in different ways so that we don't have this gigantic prison population anymore.
Yes, excellent. Let's ask some questions that are coming from people who are attending. There's one that was posted early on about do the examples provided by our government regarding resolving international conflict, endless war, deadly sanctions, xenophobic rhetoric, demonization, do these things contribute to an atmosphere that drives prison cruelty?
Yes, it does. It drives prison cruelty. It also gives the idea that, being, strong or being manly or whatever is, could involve and should involve sort of like acts of violence, so we teach people from an early age, like, like don't hit, blah, 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 this, that, and the other. And then we bombard them with images that glorify violence. We have these, as the, commenter asked, endless wars. We have these deadly sanctions. We know that people are dying in countries where we've imposed sanctions. There is xenophobic rhetoric, especially under the last occupant of the White House, to quote Angela Davis's, refusal to name Trump ever while he was in office. The xenophobic rhetoric that others people and makes it okay for them to be targets because somehow they're not quite people, if you're, othering them. So you have the xenophobic rhetoric. We also have, homophobic rhetoric and transphobic rhetoric, which makes people believe that it is okay to attack gay and trans people simply for walking down the street. We have these endless shows, like this endless media bombardment that glorifies violence as well. So it continually tells us that contrary to what your kindergarten teacher told you, which is, keep your hands to yourself, we don't hit, we use our words, etc. We have this whole other wave of messages that basically is like, yeah, we don't hit, but, see all these other people hitting, either very literally or figuratively. Yeah, that's fine. And that is a perfectly acceptable response. You come and you do something bad on our shores, we're going to go and we are going to wipe out your country.
Another question from our audience. What do you see as the top alternatives, or what would be most beneficial to work on first in terms of alternatives to prison?
Well, I don't know if there's any like top alternative. I mean, I think that you should look around and see what is around you, because I think that maybe effective alternatives or effective things to work on are the things that you can most easily plug into. So like, I wouldn't tell Linda, like go work all the way over here where you don't know anything about it and you're not, able to like plug in effectively. You might be like, oh, what is this local group doing that I could plug into? It might be as something as like, is your county or jurisdiction planning to build a new and bigger jail? And if so, why, and for what purpose? And could there be an alternative to that? Is this because they're expecting, to arrest more people for low-level crimes? The Atlanta City Detention Center was built for the 1996 Olympics. It's a giant, like 11 or 17-story building in downtown Atlanta. It towers over everything else, and it was built specifically to hide away the homeless and the undesirable people on the streets during the 1996 Olympics. So so there are jails that are built specifically for, and then it remains in operation ever since then. So it's sort of like, why would you build a jail to hide away homeless people? Why not just figure out housing solutions for homeless people, which is a much better solution than pouring all of your resources into building a jail. So I would say, look at what is happening in your community, look at where you can plug in. There's so many groups that are organizing, see what kinds of criminal justice policies are being proposed or are already there that you can help work to either dismantle or make better. So if people are proposing new tough on crime type of acts, get involved in organizing against those. If people are working to repeal certain state laws that would, help get people out of prison and help prevent more people from being funneled into the criminal legal system, then get involved with that. You can also get involved, more broadly and work to, end, mandatory minimums. There's Families Against Mandatory Minimums. If you are in Boston, there's Families for Justice for Healing. So I would say it depends on where you are. I don't want to be like, oh, here are the top 5. And it turns out that Linda is not near any of the top 5. But it would be good to work on things that dismantle, terrible policies that have landed so many people in prison, and to help prevent either more jails and more prisons from coming up, if that's what's happening in your community, or work on policies that would help bring people home, and bringing people home to supportive services, not just dumping them on a street corner and expecting them to figure out what to do with the rest of their lives.
But there is reason to be optimistic. I mean, if you look at where things are at, the pendulum is swinging back toward this idea that, we've done enough of this punishment. We've done enough of this mass incarceration. We need to try and do other things. So I do think that there's opportunities for people to participate in this process to bring about better policies.
Yes. Oh, and one other answer to Linda's question is that alternatives don't necessarily always have to be in the prison or mass incarceration or criminal justice arena. I mean, if you look at, all the pathways to prison, you could also look at economic justice, is an alternative to incarceration. If people had living wage jobs and there were more living wage jobs, people wouldn't be turning to criminalized activity. If you live in a town where prisons are the main economy, what other economies could there be? So looking at things like economic justice, looking at things like making sure there's safe and affordable housing for people, it's also an alternative to prison, because people, when they come out of jail or prison and they don't have safe places to go, end up often being homeless, often end up being, this ends up destabilizing their already precarious lives. So you can also look at all of the things that are, alternatives to prison, which we, who do not experience incarceration take for granted, like housing, food, shelter, jobs, meaningful lives. So look at this is part of a panoply of responses to how do we dismantle prisons? We build stronger, more robust and safer communities. And then I see in the comments, Maureen, hi Maureen, from New York City, points out that if you're in New York, there's Survived and Punished New York, which works with incarcerated abuse survivors, and also, both supporting them while they're inside and helping them figure out how to gain their freedom, and RAP, which is Release Aging People in Prison, which is also a New York-based group, which works on policies that would allow people serving long to life sentences, mostly for crimes involving violence, such as murder, manslaughter, assault, but serving things like 25 to life, 30 to life. One person I interviewed is serving something like 50 years to life, for policies that would allow them to appear before the parole board sooner, meaning that they would be allowed to appear before the parole board after they've reached a certain age, and parole is not a guaranteed get out of jail free card, and they would be able to make the case that they have transformed their lives. They are not a threat to society. They should no longer be incarcerated because of something they did when they were age 20 or 23 or 25. For viewers that are no longer in their 20s, think back to when you were in your 20s and think about the most embarrassing or stupid thing you ever did, and think about how far you've come. If you're in your 20s, think about the most embarrassing, stupid thing you did when you were 13 or 14, and think of how far you've come in, that time. Now think about being 60 and still being in prison for something you did when you were 20 or 23 or 25. Think about being, 70 and still being in prison and not having any hope of even getting to see the parole board until you're 80 or 85 or 90 for that thing that you did when you were in your 20s. So policies like that as well.
I don't think there are other questions that are showing up, at least for me, in the chat room here. There was a comment about the Prison Ministry Project in Madison and Wisconsin, which is a great organization. Jerry Hancock is part of that. I have one other question. Maybe I should ask it and we can wrap up. Obviously, there's a lot of television shows and movies about prison that reflect the falsehoods and myths that you refute in your book. But do you have any nominees for a television show, Orange is the New Black, or other shows or films about prison life that you think are enlightening and worthwhile?
I don't know if I know of any prison show. It
Have
is
you seen Orange is the
enlightening.
New Black?
I have seen Orange is the New Black. I think it is a good opener for people. I mean, I remember when I first started reporting in the early 2000s on prisons, there were very few people writing about prisons, even fewer writing about women in prison. I remember in the mid 2000s, and even maybe in the 2010s. So my daughter is now 20, but when she was younger, I would go to, kids' birthday parties or whatever. You wouldn't know anybody else there because, you drop your kid off at school, you go home, or go to work. You don't necessarily like stand around and chat with people. So I would meet other parents and we would start talking and they'd be like, so, my name is so-and-so, that's my kid over there. Who are you? And they'd be like, oh, what do you do? And I'd say, oh, I report on prisons or I report on women in prisons. And they'd be like, that's nice. And I'd be like, yeah, I just finished a story about pregnancy in prison. Did you know that 3 to 5% of women enter prison pregnant each year? That's nice. And you could kind of see them starting to look around for that escape. And then I'd say and then I'd say something else, and I'd be like, yeah, so, the woman I interviewed, she was chained while she was pregnant, but now she's fighting for a law to end the shackling of women in prison. And they'd be like, yeah, that's great. I got to go pick up my kid and leave now. And so with Orange is the New Black, I'd be at, some similar type of event or party. And they'd be like, oh, what do you do? And I'd be like, oh, I report on women in prison. And they'd be like, oh, like Orange is the New Black. And I'd be like, yeah, but now let's, and they'd be like, oh, I've seen an episode or I've seen this. And then I could talk about some of the issues that the show got wrong, because it is kind of like a comedy. So they get some things wrong. I understand it's based on Piper Kerman's memoir, which does not get things wrong, but obviously it's a show meant for humor and drama and not necessarily hard facts about prison. So there's some things that they get wrong, like they call compassionate release, which we talked earlier about the aging population in prisons. And there's a very little utilized release valve called compassionate release, in which the prison is somebody applies because they have 6 months to live and they have a terminal illness and they can apply for compassionate release. So they can spend the last 6 months of their lives with their loved ones instead of shackled to a prison bed, surrounded by prison guards and no friendly face among them. It is very rarely used. In reality, most people die while they're waiting for any sort of answer on their compassionate release. But in Orange is the New Black, there's an older woman who has dementia. She keeps wandering around the prison. Her friends kind of, after a while, she gets so bad that her friends can't kind of hide this. So the prison decides that rather than deal with her, I think she jumps off something thinking that she's 17 and at a swimming party again, and she breaks her arm. And then the prison is like, okay, we're done with you. So they just basically dump her at a bus station. And it's explained that this is what's called compassionate release. And in reality, compassionate release is something that you really have to fight for. It's not that the prison gets sick of taking care of you and dumps you at the bus station, but it's a chance for people to be able to go home, spend whatever time they have left with their loved ones, and then be able to, well, nobody gets to really die on their own terms, but die more on their own terms. Not, again, behind a prison wall or in a prison hospital ward where their family isn't able to be with them, but instead maybe they can spend their last, months with family members taking care of them or getting to know grandchildren or great-grandchildren or whoever, they haven't been able to meet because they were in prison, being able to maybe eat foods that they never thought they'd eat again, or, do activities, everyday boring activities with their families. Let's all just watch TV together and ignore each other. Yeah, we can do that, as opposed to saying, I'm just going to never see my family again and die surrounded by prison guards. So Orange is the New Black was, sort of a fun show, but it also didn't give a very accurate portrait of prison life sometimes. But it was a great opener for, me now talking to people about prisons and not having them literally take their kid away from me.
Well, thank you, Vicki, for your time tonight and for your excellent book. I would encourage all of our audience members to get and read your book. It's well worth it. It's enlightening. It's important. And thank you for your work. And I hope we talk again. Norm is popping in the picture here.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you very much, Victoria Law. The brand new book, which is just came out, Prisons Make Us Safer and 20 Other Myths About Mass Incarceration. You can read Bill Leader's review of the book in the latest issue of the Progressive magazine. You can also read it on our website, as well as another interview with Victoria done by Eleanor Bader, one of our regular writers on the website as well. Our website, progressive.org, is also a place that you can subscribe to the magazine. You can support us with your donations. And we have a special link for tonight to get a copy of the book, brand new. And it's indiepublishers.org/book event. You see it there on the screen, and also it's in the chat on the Facebook feed of this program. And I encourage you to check it out. It supports the Progressive magazine. It supports our work, which includes giving free subscriptions to any inmate that requests one. And it also supports everything that we do here at the magazine. And I also want to thank A Room of One's Own bookstore, a local independent Madison, Wisconsin bookstore that has been supporting all of these events that we've been doing, co-sponsoring them with us. We've got another one coming up in a week on Thursday, the 15th of April, with author Chuck Collins and his brand new book about the Wealth Hoarders, particularly appropriate on what would have been tax day if they hadn't moved it ahead a month, but talking about how billionaires conceal their wealth. And this is wealth that could be used, obviously, to support all of the programs that we've been talking about tonight in terms of social services and healthcare and so on, that are not readily available to people on the outside, that would make our society a much different place. So Victoria Law, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Again, the book Prisons Make Us Safer and 20 Other Myths About Mass Incarceration, and Bill Leaders, editor of the Progressive magazine. Thank you as well.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. It was I don't want to say pleasurable conversation, but it was definitely a great conversation. I'm so glad to have had it with you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi.